There is a small stone building still standing in a hollow in Mitchell County, North Carolina, half buried in rhododendron. Its roof sagging, but its walls true. And if you open the door today, you will hear the same sound that a family heard there 200 years ago. Water, moving, constant, indifferent to the seasons outside. This building kept food safe for generations without a single watt of electricity, without ice delivered by wagon, without any mechanism at all except gravity and stone. What it knew how to do, modern refrigeration has spent less than a century learning to replace. This is the story of that secret, why it had to exist, and why almost nobody remembers how it worked. Before we go further, a quick note. A lot of you are watching this on a television screen rather than a phone, which means you might be scrolling past the subscribe button without ever tapping it. If this kind of mountain history is worth your time, subscribing genuinely helps a small channel like this keep going. And sharing it with one other person who'd find it interesting does more for its future than almost anything else. Now, back into the mountains. Picture the hollow itself before the building even comes into view. Fog sits low over the ridgeline most mornings until the sun climbs high enough to burn it off. And the path down to the spring is usually nothing more than packed dirt, worn smooth by decades of bare feet and boots making the same trip. Twice a day. Every day. Regardless of weather. Smoke rises from a cabin chimney further up the slope. Thin and constant, mixing with the smell of wet leaves and turned earth. In deep winter, the trail might be the only unbroken line in a foot of snow, evidence that someone has already gone down before dawn to check on what the night left behind. The forest around the spring is usually old, untouched. Oak and hickory and the ghost of chestnut trees that used to dominate this canopy before a blight wiped them out in the early 20th century. Their understory thick with rhododendron that stays green even when everything else has gone bare. Lanterns, not flashlights, lit these trips after dark. Their light weak enough that a person learned the path by feel as much as by sight, counting steps between the porch and the spring door without needing to see either one clearly. The Appalachian range that cradles Mitchell County is older than almost anything alive to remember it. A chain of peaks worn down over roughly 480 million years, until what remains are rounded shoulders of rock rather than sharp teeth. But age had given the mountains something else besides softened slopes. It had given them water. Centuries of rain and snowmelt had worked their way down through fractured granite and gneiss, pooling in underground seams, finding cracks, and emerging again at the surface as springs that ran cold and clear, regardless of whether the month was January or July. Early settlers moving into these coves in the late 1700s. Many of them Scots-Irish, German, and English families pushing west along the Great Wagon Road and then up into the hollows where flatter land ran out. Learned to read the landscape by where the springs were. A homestead without a reliable spring was not a homestead worth building. The water decided where the cabin went, where the barn went, and where the family would still be living 100 years later, or whether they would already have moved on. There is a reason this particular landscape produces springs reliable enough to build an entire food system around. And it has to do with what lies beneath the soil rather than what grows above it. Appalachian bedrock in this part of the range is heavily fractured granite, gneiss, and in some pockets limestone, riddled with the kind of underground cavities geologists call karst, a structure that lets water sink deep, travel along fracture lines, and re-emerge at a roughly constant depth-driven temperature rather than swinging with the weather overhead. A spring fed this way is, in effect, plumbed into the steady temperature of the Earth's upper crust below the frost line, a number that simply does not care whether the surface is baking in August or buried in a February storm. Families never needed the word karst or any formal geology to use this. They needed only to notice which hollows kept a spring running cold and strong through the driest part of summer, and to build there rather than somewhere prettier but less dependable. The mountains, for all they gave these families, withheld one resource that a temperate climate simply does not hand over for free: cold, on demand, in July. Thirst was never the hard problem here. The harder problem was surviving the long stretch between a hog slaughter in November and the first greens of April, a season in which almost everything a family produced wanted to rot before it could be eaten. Milk soured within hours in summer heat. Butter went rancid. Meat, unless cured perfectly, bred the kind of bacteria that could put a grown man in bed for a week or kill a child. And there was no doctor within a day's ride to help if it did. Disease moved through these communities not as an abstraction, but as a constant companion. And a surprising amount of it traced back not to wild animals or accidents, but to food that had simply gone bad sitting in a warm kitchen because there was nowhere colder to put it. The nearest physician, in many of these communities well into the early 20th century, might be a full day's ride away over terrain that made even a healthy person's journey slow, and a sick person's journey nearly impossible. Spoiled milk did not announce itself the way a rattlesnake or a falling tree did. It worked quietly, through diarrhea and dehydration that could take an infant from healthy to gravely ill within a single day, or through the kind of bacterial illness in improperly kept meat that left a grown adult unable to work the fields for a week during a season when missing a week of work could mean missing the harvest entirely. Mountain families did not have the luxury of treating food safety as a minor household chore. It sat closer to the center of survival than firewood did, because firewood failures were visible and food failures often were not, until it was too late to do anything but wait and hope the fever broke. The answer the mountains offered, if a family was willing to build for it, was already running past their door. A spring emerging from deep underground carries with it the constant temperature of the earth below the frost line, a number that barely moves no matter what the sky is doing. Measured at springs across the region, that number sits reliably between roughly 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, summer or winter, drought or flood. It is not cold enough to freeze anything. It is exactly cold enough to slow the clock on spoilage to a crawl. Families who understood this did not dig a hole and hope. They built a small structure directly over or immediately beside the spring's outflow, often banked into the side of a hill the way a barn might be banked for the same insulating reason, with thick stone or log walls that kept outside heat from radiating in, and a stone-lined channel inside that let the spring water run continuously through a shallow trough along the floor. Crocks of milk, blocks of butter wrapped in cloth, jars of cream, sometimes whole hams hung from hooks driven into the ceiling beams, sat in or beside that moving water day and night, all year, with no fire, no ice, and no electricity required at any point in the process. The water itself was the machine, and it never stopped running, which meant it never stopped working. What made this more than a clever trick was how completely it had to be trusted. A spring house had no dial to check, no light to tell a family the temperature had drifted. Trust was built the same way every other mountain skill was built, by watching, by failure, and by passing the knowledge down before the next failure could happen again. One generation teaching the next how deep into the channel to set a crock of milk, how close to the wall to hang a ham so it caught the coolest moving air, which corner of the structure ran warmest because of how the afternoon sun struck the hillside above it, was not handing down folklore. It was handing down a survival technology refined over more than 2 centuries, tested against the one outcome nobody could afford. A family getting sick from food that should have kept them alive. The structures themselves carried real engineering inside their simplicity. Many were built with 2 levels, the lower given over entirely to the spring channel and the cool storage it allowed. The upper sometimes used as a small workroom where butter was churned and cheese was pressed, kept just far enough from the coldest air to remain workable rather than frozen solid. Some families used a butter churn turned not by hand, but by a small dog or sheep walking an endless circle on a treadmill built into the floor. A detail that sounds almost comic today, but reflects something quite serious. Dairy work in a household without refrigeration was constant, physically exhausting, and never finished. So any mechanism that could relieve even part of that daily burden was worth building. A handful of these structures, including one documented at Tomahawk in West Virginia, were built solidly enough and maintained carefully enough that they still stand today, recognized on the National Register of Historic Places, stone witnesses to a system that worked for longer than almost any other piece of pre-industrial technology in American rural life. When folklorists and students working on the Foxfire Project began documenting Appalachian life in the 1960s, spring houses were one of the practices they found still alive in living memory, even as refrigerators had already become standard in most American kitchens elsewhere. One mountain farmer they interviewed in Georgia explained, in his own words, that he still preferred keeping meat in his spring house rather than his refrigerator, because food stored there never picked up the faint metallic odor that a mechanical fridge could leave behind. It was a small preference, almost a stubbornness, but it captured something larger. For people who had grown up trusting moving water over any machine, the machine had to prove itself, not the other way around. The same logic that shaped spring houses also shaped the bank barns built into hillsides across these mountains, structures where one side was set against the slope and the other left open to the air, using the earth itself as a thermal buffer against both summer heat and winter cold. A family did not need an engineering degree to notice that a hillside, used correctly, behaved like a refrigerator on one side and a windbreak on the other. They simply built accordingly, structure after structure, generation after generation, until the technique stopped looking like an invention and started looking like common knowledge. The work itself never let up, and that is easy to lose sight of from this distance. Twice a day, sometimes more in the height of summer when milk soured fastest, someone walked down to the spring house, checked what was inside, rearranged crocks to keep the coldest water against whatever was spoiling fastest, and carried back up whatever was ready to be eaten or sold. In winter, that walk happened in the dark on both ends of the day. Lantern light bouncing off ice-slicked stone steps. Hands numb before the door was even reached. There was no version of this system that ran itself. It demanded a body, every single day, regardless of how that body felt or what else needed doing. The reward for that discipline was simple and total: food that did not kill you, income that kept the household solvent, and a margin of safety that, in a region without doctors on call, was sometimes the only margin a family had. The economic weight of this single building is easy to underestimate from a distance of 2 centuries. In households across these mountains, it was very often the woman of the house who managed the spring house, who decided what went in it, who calculated how long the butter could hold before it had to be carried to a country store in exchange for store credit, or, on a good week, actual cash. Records kept by farm women through the early and middle 20th century show this income, often called butter and egg money, tracked down to the penny in handwritten ledgers, tens of dollars a month that covered shoes, school supplies, or a rare treat the rest of the household budget never had room for. One such ledger, kept faithfully across the early 1950s, recorded over $200 a year from butter and eggs combined, a sum that in a cash-poor mountain economy could mean the difference between a hard winter and a survivable one. None of that income existed without a working spring house behind it, because without reliable cooling, there was no butter to sell, only butter that had gone rancid on the walk to town. The isolation that made all of this necessary cannot be overstated. A family 3 or 4 miles up a hollow, past where any wagon could reasonably travel once the road turned to mud or ice, was not running to a neighbor for a cup of borrowed milk or a block of ice from a delivery wagon, the way town families increasingly could by the early 1900s. Commercial ice delivery, when it eventually reached rural areas at all, depended on roads passable enough for a wagon or truck to make regular rounds, something many mountain hollows simply did not have until well into the 20th century. Until then, the spring house was not a backup system. It was the only system, and everyone in the household understood, without needing to be told twice, what happened if it failed. A summer of spoiled milk was not an inconvenience. It was a threat to the youngest and the oldest in the house, the two groups least able to recover from the kind of sickness bad dairy could cause. Curiosity sat right alongside the hardship. Because these structures were stranger and more varied than a single design might suggest. Some spring houses doubled as the very first dwelling on a new homestead, a snug two-room building that sheltered a family while a larger house was raised nearby, only to be handed over afterward entirely to food storage once its original purpose was finished. Others were built with a second door facing the hillside, specifically so that a person could enter without disturbing the channel of water running through the main room. A small design choice that meant the difference between clean drinking water and water that had been stepped through and contaminated. Stonemasons building these structures had no formal training in microbiology, no understanding of bacteria in the way we describe it now. Yet they had independently arrived at a design that kept pathogens from spreading exactly the way modern food safety science would later explain. They called it common sense, learned the hard way, generation after generation. The decline came slowly enough that almost no one alive at the time could have named the exact year the spring house stopped being essential. Through the 1800s, it was simply how things were done. By the early decades of the 1900s, commercial ice delivery had begun creeping into towns and the larger valley farms, offering the icebox as a faster, less labor-intensive alternative for households that could afford the service and reach it. Rural electrification arrived unevenly across these mountains over the following decades, bringing with it, eventually, the electric refrigerator, a machine that did the spring house's job without requiring anyone to walk outside in a snowstorm to check on a crock of milk. By the 1930s and 40s in many communities, and considerably later in some of the more remote hollows, the spring house quietly stopped being a necessity and became, instead, a relic, sometimes still used for an overflow of garden produce or a watermelon too large for the icebox, but no longer the only thing standing between a family and spoiled food. What disappeared with that transition was not simply a building, it was an entire body of inherited judgment. How to read a hillside for where a spring would run strong and cold, how to angle a channel so the coldest water reached the milk first, how to build walls thick enough to hold the Earth's own temperature against a July afternoon without a single calculation on paper. All of it carried in the hands and memory of people who never wrote a manual because the knowledge was meant to be lived, not read. Some of that knowledge survives in oral history projects and in the handful of spring houses still standing in places like Mitchell County, Pennsylvania Dutch Country, and the hills of eastern Kentucky, where one structure built in the 1780s remains one of the oldest of its kind, still upright in the country. But the daily, instinctive fluency that once let a mountain family run an entire cold storage system with no instructions, no electricity, and no margin for error, has largely gone quiet. The way a language goes quiet when the last fluent speakers stop using it in everyday conversation. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the secret which kept these families alive for well over 2 centuries was never hidden, never secret in the way we usually mean that word. It was sitting in plain sight, in cold water running past a doorway, available to anyone who understood that the mountain itself, given the right structure to hold it, would do the work of refrigeration for free, forever, without being asked twice. The technology required no patent, no electricity grid, no supply chain. It required only attention, the willingness to build correctly the first time, and a kind of trust in the land that very few of us are ever asked to develop anymore. Today, most of us could not tell you the temperature of the nearest spring to our home, or whether one even exists. We do not need to know. The refrigerator hums quietly in the kitchen and the question never arises. But somewhere in Mitchell County, and in a scattering of hollows across Kentucky, West Virginia, and the rest of the Appalachian Range, those small stone buildings are still standing, water still moving through them whether anyone is watching or not, holding open a door to a kind of self-sufficiency that asked everything of the people who depended on it, and gave back in return exactly what it promised, for as long as anyone needed it to.